Welcome to Disrupting Peace, a show about why peace hasn't worked and how it still could. I'm Bridget Conley, Research Director at the World Peace Foundation. So immigration is an enormously important issue in this year's presidential election. One of the ironies of the debate is that the Republican candidate's wife is an immigrant, and the wife of his vice presidential candidate is first-generation American. The Democratic candidate is also a first-generation American. But despite these real experiences, Trump vows to mount the largest deportation effort in American history. At the same time, Harris promises to expand legal immigration, but she also supports an enforcement-first border policy, which includes more funding for detention and more hurdles for asylum seekers. So what impact will the upcoming U.S. election have on immigration? To help us explore this issue, I'm speaking with Jason De León. Jason is professor of anthropology and Chicana, Chicano, and Central American Studies at UCLA, executive director of the Undocumented Migration Project, and author of the award-winning book, The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail. His new book, Soldiers and Kings, is an in-depth look at the daily lives of smugglers moving migrants across the length of Mexico. Together, we'll explore the current state of immigration in the U.S., the areas where both Democrats and Republicans are getting things wrong, and why increasing empathy is necessary to create change. One note before we dive in is that, as you know, we usually hear from both a researcher and an activist. Unfortunately, today's activist was feeling under the weather and couldn't join us. However, this is just a change for today, and you can look forward to hearing both perspectives in future episodes. Okay, here's the conversation. Jason, welcome to Disrupting Peace.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so we are going to focus on migration and the U.S., largely, or at least migration towards the U.S. But before we dive into the topic, I thought we might look more broadly at global trends to put it in context by way of a quiz. And this is all information from the International Organization of Migration from their 2023 data. Okay, can you guess any one or more than one of the countries that have the highest numbers of emigration, people leaving?
Haiti, Venezuela, Honduras, and I guess I'll say Mexico just because Mexico.
Okay, I have the top 5 here. India, Mexico, Russia, China, and Syria.
Oh.
Still Syria. Okay, which country has the highest proportion of immigrants within its population?
Brazil, Mexico. I'm going to stop there because I just feel like I'm going to just throw countries out there. And I mean,
it's United Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
And the
Filipinos.
Yeah, and Southeast Asian, right?
Yeah.
88%,
Yep.
which is an insane number. And finally, and we'll get closer to your area of real expertise, what is the largest, by numbers of people crossing, pathway for migration today?
I'd probably put Mexico, the United States.
Yes, absolutely correct. Jason, to get started, though, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you began working on migration, working around the Mexican border, and then later on the pathways of migration from Central America.
Well, I began my career as a sort of run-of-the-mill archaeologist. And so my early work as an undergraduate and as a graduate student was on ancient stone tools. I was doing archaeology in Latin America, especially in locations in Mexico that had high out-migration rates. And it was during the course of that work that I'm digging ditches with local people who are getting paid to assist archaeologists. And folks who start telling me all these stories about things that had happened to them crossing the Sonora Desert of Arizona, being deported, all the kind of brutal things that migrants experience. And it was during that work that I became increasingly more interested in the stories of those folks were telling me and less interested in what was coming out of the ground. And so, after about 10 years of doing archaeological work, I finished my dissertation, decided to completely shift gears and to begin thinking about how could I use anthropology to understand these issues around undocumented migration.
Jason, is your family, you grew up as a military kid, right? Army brat?
Yeah.
Were either of your parents immigrants?
My mom's from the Philippines, my dad's from Mexico.
Ah, okay.
And so I lived all over the country and in Europe as a kid. My dad grew up in the Rio Grande Valley near McAllen. It's about 6-7 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. I went to elementary school there and then moved to California when I was in 6th grade. And I was born in California, but was kind of coming back and forth. But, I grew up with a lot of undocumented family members on both sides of my family. I grew up crossing the border to Mexico constantly. I remember the Border Patrol coming to my elementary school to do presentations when I was a kid, which now I think about such a crazy, mind-boggling. Growing up as a person of color in all these different places really impacted the way I thought about things. I remember being in Philadelphia and as a kid and feeling like I was a fish out of water, being in South Texas and then not realizing that I was a minority and moving across those spaces. In some contexts, it's really embarrassing to be a child of an immigrant. And in other places, it's like you were the oddball if you weren't.
I think too, having parents from 2 different countries and 2 different cultures, in addition to the third one in the United States, it's a lot of negotiation for a kid. So in your work documenting, especially migration across the southern border into the U.S. and at the artifacts that people leave behind, does that draw on then that history that you had as an archaeology student?
It definitely does. I thought I was never going to do archaeology ever again. And it wasn't until I was standing in the middle of the Arizona desert looking at thousands of backpacks and water bottles and having this aha moment of, I've been trained to think about time and space and landscape and the environment and materiality as an archaeologist. What happens if I apply that now in this contemporary, highly politicized environment? What can I say about the world through those different perspectives?
So I want to turn now to talk about how we think about immigration in the context of the American presidential election. The topic of immigration and political discourse today is cartoonishly militant on the one side, right, with Trump vowing to mount the largest deportation effort in American history. And on the other, it's really, I would describe it as indecisively hawkish, right? So trying to win the Hispanic vote, but also to walk a middle line where you could still appear tough and militant about protecting the border. What for you is missing from the current public discussion in U.S. politics?
A lot. I think people they see Kamala Harris as this yin to Trump's yang. And I'm like, they're a lot closer than, and the Democrats have always been anti-immigrant on some level. They're the creators of the policy prevention through deterrence that has killed thousands and disappeared thousands. It's the security that's been in place since the Clinton administration. We continue to use it. And nobody, talks about that.
So, Jason, you mentioned prevention through deterrence. Can you say a little bit more about what that policy is?
Yeah, it's a border enforcement strategy that has been in place officially since 1994. Actually, the whole thing really starts, this is an interesting story. Bowie High School in El Paso, Texas is right on the U.S.-Mexico border. It's like 95% Latino student population. People are hopping the fence near Bowie High School, running across campus, and the Border Patrol are chasing those students across campus, are chasing those migrants. But they're mistaking, they can't tell who's undocumented and who's not. So they start detaining students because they look like the people who are crossing the border. The students at Bowie High School sue the federal government and say, get these guys off campus. Same thing was happening in San Diego. People would amass on the Mexican side, high numbers, hop the fence, and then run into town, and they would sneak in and hide amongst the local population. So Border Patrol decides, okay, we're going to just make it impossible to cross in San Diego or in El Paso. The minute you hop that fence, we will catch everybody and send you right back. But if you go 10 miles east of El Paso, the Waal drops off. You can just walk around there, but now you got to walk a lot farther to get where you're going. And so, the Border Patrol will watch people marching through the desert and wait until they are exhausted or near death to go in and try to catch them, or they'll just let them die. And, keep in mind, prior to 1994, you had maybe a couple dozen deaths along the entire length of the U.S.-Mexico border in any given year. And then once this policy goes into place and starts pushing people into the Sonora Desert, now you've got hundreds of deaths happening just in that location alone. The Border Patrol thought that if enough people died during that process, that word of mouth would spread. People say it's too dangerous, you shouldn't do it, and then it would stop. Unfortunately, it isn't. I mean, death is not a deterrent. I mean, people are fleeing hunger, famine, climate change, war, violence, and so they keep coming, and they keep dying in the Arizona desert. Now they're dying in New Mexico and Texas. I mean, this is what's in place right now along the U.S.-Mexico border. The problem is that nobody ever says this out loud.
Yeah, it just made me think, Jason, this is all, the world that was promised at the end of the Cold War. This world where we would be more at peace, the U.S. would lead the international community to a more just, a more free, a more democratic future. It's shocking to see the betrayal of it. Just when you mentioned the date of 1994, just struck home. My work all looks at, atrocity prevention, where we started intervening all around the world at the same time to try to prevent people from dying. And you lay that over with the world you're describing, right, which is a border policy that increases death, that intentionally uses the desert as a way to cause death. It's a pretty head-spinning contradiction.
Yeah. What's happening with the border thing, it's really frustrating for a whole bunch of reasons. I think part of it is because it's always the go-to straw man, boogeyman, whatever you want to let's blame immigrants, let's blame migrants, let's talk about border security so we can avoid talking about U.S. interventionist policies and the countries where these people are fleeing from. We don't have to talk about climate change, the domestic economy, all these kinds of things. I think what's really happening too, and it's interesting to see it unfold, is that there's this assumption that Latinos, from my perspective, are that immigration and borders, that's our number one priority. But Latinos are a very diverse demographic with a lot of right-leaning folks. I mean, depending on where you are in the United States, if you're in Miami versus in Los Angeles, I mean, very different perspectives on border security. And I think I always like to remind people that, the Border Patrol is primarily Latinx folks, right? I mean, and so what does that mean to be hard on the border and to be there's this anti-Latino kind of rhetoric? And the gatekeepers are Latinos themselves, who have very interesting and oftentimes kind of conflicting perspectives on what the problems are. But it's a real mess. I mean, right now, Harris being hard on border issues, I mean, that's really courting, the middle right and the right as well, who are just finally getting fed up with Donald Trump. I mean, the Harris approach right now feels to me as tone deaf as when she stands in front of a bunch of reporters in Guatemala and says, "Do not come to the United States because we're all full here," kind of thing. I mean, that's feigning ignorance and towing that kind of line is what a lot of those voters that they're trying to court want to hear.
And in opposition to that, in your work, you document very carefully why people are leaving and, make direct connections between the impact of hurricanes, increased hurricanes, and climate change and why people leave. You also talk about, in some of the stories that you document in the new book, this incredible violence that surrounds people, right, that makes going back to Honduras life-threatening. People try to go back, they try to rebuild, and their lives are threatened. Notes on doors, family members being killed. And you describe a context where there is no childhood, there's no safety, they cannot live there. Just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the specific role that direct threats of violence play.
I showed a video in my class yesterday called Which Way Home, which is a documentary about Central American kids crossing Mexico in the mid-2000s, 2007. And there's a scene there where this Border Patrol agent is talking about, all the horrible things that happen to kids crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. And he says it's these smugglers' faults. And he says, and these kids are getting assaulted in all kinds of different ways. And these horrible parents are doing these things to these kids. I can't believe this. And my response is, how horrible must it be where you live that the best decision that you could make for your children and for yourself and for your family is to put them into the hands of a stranger, is to drag them through the Arizona desert? People just don't get that. And, the violence in Latin America and places like Mexico and Central America, people are living with this violence on a daily basis. I mean, the thing that really stuck with me in the beginning, starting to work with folks from Honduras who were fleeing that, was everybody that I met had seen someone that they care about be murdered. It wasn't that everyone that I met knew someone who would be murdered. They knew many people who had been murdered, but they had seen it,
They've witnessed it.
Yeah. And I started thinking to myself, do I know anybody that has, I've never seen someone be murdered. But for these folks, it was like, didn't matter where you were from. This was part of your everyday kind of experience.
So if there was one thing that you could change about, or you could inflect into the discussion about immigration that maybe could enact change, do you think there's a way to think about it differently that would help shift, however slightly?
I wish I could teach collective empathy. I wish that people could truly put themselves in these other places and think about what they would do if they were living in Honduras, what they would do if they had a sick child in Venezuela, what would be the lengths that they would go to provide safety for those family members. For me, I don't think there's any comprehensive immigration reform without some deeper reflections about who we are as a species and what we are going through in these different places. Because right now, I mean, when we talk about comprehensive immigration from the United States, it's always about the US-Mexico border. And I think that's the last place that we need to be spending all this time and energy. We need to be thinking about what's disruptive in these other places. Why are people leaving these countries? And then what is drawing them here, right? Like, and how do we benefit from that draw?
Is there anywhere where you see policy working in terms of immigration?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any good example. What you're really seeing is the adoption of U.S. policies in these. I mean, Mexico is starting to look a lot like the United States in terms of the numbers of deportation, immigration enforcement on the ground, all the various strategies that they're starting to employ. Although locally, sanctuary communities and these rural places in the U.S. that are saying like, not here, the pushback against all the anti-immigrant rhetoric, that gives me hope. And I think that it's really about the local coalition building that we hope will lead to a national and potentially beyond that kind of movement.
Okay, Jason. So there are a lot of people, especially in poor white communities, who believe that immigrants are taking their jobs, right? Believe that they're taking opportunities that should belong to established American citizens, people whose jobs are themselves precarious. How do you respond to that?
I mean, this is a classic problem, right? I mean, this is like a Karl Marx problem, right? Like class consciousness. If the people who are in these positions could recognize that they're just as screwed as everybody else, right? What would that realization then mean for affecting change? And I think that politicians know that, the powers that be know that. And so they work very, very hard to create divisiveness amongst these groups, because if the poor were to unite, then suddenly the upper crust will find themselves in a lot of trouble. I mean, I remember I went to a Trump rally in Warren, Michigan in 2016, and I thought it'd be funny to go. I was like, oh, let's just go watch this clown kind of do this thing. And, I could tell my kids that this one time I went to this rally and this reality star was going to run for president. And it was so ridiculous. Trump says, and this is a room full of auto workers. He says, we are going to build this great, big, beautiful wall. We're going to stop the Mexicans from taking their auto work jobs in Mexico, and we're going to bring them all back. And people are cheering and they love it. And, from their perspective, it's Mexico who is stealing their jobs. It's not the capitalists who control these factories who go, we make a lot more money. We make these cars in Puebla. But people don't want to, they don't want to think about that. And the politicians obviously also don't want that to be sort of known.
But the core thing, Jason, what you said is also poor Mexican laborers who are not being paid as well as Michigan laborers did not steal your jobs. They're not the ones making the profit, right? It's corporations have made enormous profit by moving jobs to pay people less.
And even if Trump's exercise and like mass deportation, if that were to happen, the first thing we would see would be an utter collapse of our economy. And maybe that's what it takes for some of these folks who refuse to see the economic interconnections to be like, oh, I'm so stupid. Why didn't I think about this? Why didn't I see this? It's like that film, like A Day Without a Mexican, where, suddenly all the Mexican immigrants disappear and everything goes to hell.
Jason, if you could pass policy on immigration, this great immigration reform package, the elusive legislative changes, what would you prioritize? Is there a way to make immigration policy more rational and responsive?
I think if you had a guest worker program and we took it seriously to where these employers have to be accountable for all the things that are happening, and then we would take seriously the reports from the employees, like a Yelp for employers that we took seriously and said, oh, You didn't pay this person what you said you were going to pay them. You made them do X, Y, and Z. Well, you're done, right? They're leaving. You're going to pay them back pay, and you will no longer be able to hire these workers. I think if we had something along those lines, that could work. The problem is that America and much of the global north, we love unregulated capitalism. I mean, that's our bread and butter. And even those who are not pulling the strings of that benefit greatly, keeps prices down, makes things accessible for some folks. And so regulating capitalism, I do think it's a needed thing to have this program really be one that's equitable. But then you also, we live in an overly monitored society, right? We could regulate movement. We already do regulate it. It's scary. I'm not a proponent of the biometric, but we're already doing it. Like you go to the airport and they just scan your eyeball and they know everything about you, where you're coming, where you've gone, where you go. And I think that we could have a program where people are coming back and forth justifiably, and there's big protocols to go through that. And so, I'm not this person who thinks that no borders and everybody can kind of come and go as they please. That would be total chaos. But I think some sort of regulation, I think anything would be better than a system that heavily exploits people and just kills a lot of people.
So in addition to policies that might directly intervene on the movement of peoples across borders, are there other ways that we could change policies related to things you've mentioned, climate change or interventionism? What do you think about policy changes on those kinds of topics?
It's all connected, right? I like to tell the anti-immigrant people who are like, I hate immigrants, are stealing our jobs, more borders. And I say, you know what? If you really hate immigrants, you should become a climate activist, right? You should really get down with Greta Thunberg because these people are coming because we are messing with their environment, right? And so people obviously don't like to hear that. If we start to think about climate change and migration collectively, that then I think leads to more nuanced and potentially effective types of policy changes. I don't want to hear about immigration reform anymore without thinking about the root causes of why people are leaving.
So do you feel like Trump's election in 2016 actually ended up pushing more people to think about immigration and maybe become more actively involved?
As soon as Trump was elected, I had colleagues who were suddenly like, well, what are we going to do about this? This is crazy. And so I was excited to see people who were maybe typically apolitical or didn't want to weigh in on these conversations starting to do that. Had Hillary Clinton been elected, I think we would be very complacent about some of this stuff. And Trump is in some ways pushing people to really engage with the subject in more real ways, people who would maybe be on the sidelines. I had a conversation with someone the other day about what happens if Trump wins? What happens if they try to put into place this mass deportation thing? I said, that's a horrible thing to imagine. But also, I could also imagine the cooperation, the collective kind of movement that would inspire, and to see how far are we willing to push people before we have to make drastic change. I have two small kids at home, and part of my job is to absorb all of the horrible things that I see in the world and with the work, and come home and to say, we're going to be okay. We're going to find a way through this. This is not the first catastrophe that humans have ever experienced, and we can learn from history about how to move forward.
So, final question. We always end with an exercise in future dreaming, collective dreaming. So, okay, the U.S. reported the highest percentage of its population as immigrants, 14.8%, was in 1890. 100 years later, in 1990, the share was 7.9%, and today it's 13.9%. So, if we consider what might happen by 2090, right? So, let's just project 66 years into the future. Let's imagine at this point, U.S. immigration policies are more responsive to the needs of new U.S. communities, right, including its newcomers within those communities and with labor markets, as well as to the dignity of people who want to try to come here. So what has to happen between now and then for us to get there?
The U.S. has to recognize the contributions that immigrants make to this country in real ways. And we always talk about, the melting pot. We're a country based on immigrants, but we hate immigrants. We hate migrants. We hate them at the U.S.-Mexico border. We let them die, we let them disappear, and then we ignore them when they're, in North Carolina working in a carpet factory or rendering pigs. I think that what has to happen, this kind of moment in the future where things are more rational and sensible and kind, I think is just to finally accept how important immigrant labor and cultural and economic contributions are in this country, and just to say, I see you, I accept you, I say that you are important to my livelihood. I mean, this is like when Alabama tries to kick out all the farm workers, and then nobody in Alabama can pick tomatoes, and they have to bring them all back. I think if we were really to sit down and just say, I'm going to see you as a person and recognize that you have needs just like mine, and let's figure out then how to make this work as a community. We have to fully integrate these folks into our community, I think, in a meaningful way. But I think before we can even do that, I mean, we have our own American citizens that we don't integrate into our own communities, right? And so we need 66 years of anthropology classes on culture, race, gender. People need to just have a better understanding of who we are as a species, and how the differences are so minimal. Then we can start to then think more collectively and more communally. But we'll get there. I mean, we're working on it. The youth are leading the way, and those of us who are on places like these college campuses, right? The classroom is a place to envision this better place, and just trying to equip these new generations with the skills to get us there.
Yeah. Jason, thank you so much for your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've all heard a lot about immigration this election season, but very little about substantive policy changes that could make a difference, both in terms of U.S. domestic policy and in relation to violence in countries that people are fleeing from. Instead, the election has primarily produced escalating rhetoric. Trump certainly wins in the battle of who can be the most militant, but that's the wrong competition. You're listening to a podcast about world peace, so chances are pretty good you're going to vote in this election. But it's equally important to remain engaged long after November 5th, because no matter who wins, there will be more work to do. As Jason pointed out, a key challenge is to change the discussion of immigration policy so that it takes into account why people flee, what draws them to the U.S., and what contributions they make here. And above all else, the policy conversation, wherever it goes, needs to start with basic respect for immigrants' humanity. Thanks for listening to episode 6 of Disrupting Peace. I'm Bridget Conley. You can find out more about Jason at jasonpatrickdeleon.com. That's Jason Patrick, DELEON.com. This is the last episode of Season 1, and we are so glad you've joined us for the ride. We'd love to hear your feedback as we start planning Season 2. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover by emailing us at disruptingpeacepodcast@gmail.com. That's disruptingpeacepodcast@gmail.com. Disrupting Peace is a production of the World Peace Foundation. Find out more at worldpeacefoundation.org and follow us on X at WorldPeaceFDTN, all one word. That's WorldPeaceFDTN. The show is produced by myself and Emily Shaw. Engineering by Jacob Winnick and Asia Simpson. Marketing and social media by Kelsey Henquinet. Show artwork by Simon Fung. Special thanks to Jeremy Helton, my colleagues, Lisa Avery, B. Arneson, and Alex Duvall, and the team from the Tufts Digital Design Studio, including Kimberly, Lynn, Forero-Arnias, and Miles Donovan. Okay, until next season, stay skeptical and hopeful.